Welcome to my 186th video on my work with OO gauge. In this part I'll be doing some more track work. Specifically, having just obtained the right-hand isolating point required, I'll be adding a fourth track into my extended Hornby Dublo engine shed. This exercise required more cutting of track pieces than any of my previous track implementation because of the tight requirements for getting this extension in place. This is where I'd got to before this exercise. The extended Dublo engine shed, made from the basic Dublo engine shed plus the Dublo engine shed extension kit, was in place, but though the shed was designed to support 4 tracks, it only had 3 tracks in it. Here are those tracks with the shed itself lifted out of the way. I've got a buffer stop in place about where I expect the end of the 4th track to come. Because I knew that I was intending to make further changes, none of the track serving the engine shed was screwed down at this point, although I had screwed down all of the rest of the track on the tabletop. Here, I've roughly laid down the track that I was intending to use. A right-hand isolating point is used to branch the new track off from the neighbouring shed track. That point is separated from the preceding point, which branches the goods depot track off from the shed track by a short amount of straight track. This is necessary in order for there to be room for the operating lever plate of the new point. The short straight section needed to be about a quarter of a regular straight, but I didn't have any quarter straight sections on hand, so I was going to need to cut to create that section. Following the new point, a half curve would be needed to bring the new track parallel to the other shed tracks. Again, I didn't have any half curve sections on hand, but I had lots of standard curves, so I was planning to cut to create the required half curve. Finally, the new track would go down straight to a buffer stop at the back of the shed. Again, I was going to have to cut a custom length piece of track for this straight section due to the non-standard length required. I got the new pieces of track required onto the bench. A right-hand isolating point, a full curve, a full straight, and a half straight, and I started by cleaning the tops of the rails with extra fine emery paper on a wooden block. Then I wiped down the rails and the end contacts, etc. with electrical contact cleaner on a cloth. I tested the isolating point to make sure that the continuity of the centre rail was maintained properly, switching when the point was switched. So when the point is straight, there should be continuity between the incoming centre rail and the outgoing straight centre rail, but no continuity with the outgoing curved centre rail. Vice versa, when the point is set to turn, there should be continuity between the incoming centre rail and the outgoing curved centre rail, but no continuity with the outgoing straight centre rail. Very often these isolating points don't work properly when received, as the underlying contact mechanism is a bit fiddly and may need adjusting. In this case, whilst I did clean the contacts underneath the point, they actually worked properly and no adjustment was required. Next, I turned to cutting of track sections that was required. I find this quite a difficult and unpleasant process. I also feel a bit guilty about chopping up these track sections that have managed to survive for over 60 years. I started by cutting the short straight to go before the new point. This needed to be about a quarter of a full straight in length. I placed my cut just beyond the second support for the centre rail. I started by cutting through the rails with a razor saw, trying to keep the cut as straight across as possible and to cut as vertically as I could manage. The underlying tin plate base of the track sections is more difficult to cut through than the tracks themselves, which are made of plated brass. I used a cutting disc in a rotary tool to help with cutting through the base. It's quite fiddly to get in to cut neatly with a disc. I do always wear safety glasses when doing this sort of thing, as there is very significant likelihood of metal dust flying about, and also of the disc breaking and flinging sharp shards about. Once the sides of the base have been cut through, the section can be bent at the cut to help with completing the cut through the centre of the section. By combined use of the razor saw and the rotary cutting disc, I managed to cut separate the straight section at the cut point. The base needs to be bent down a bit using pliers to allow space under the side rails so that fish plates can be inserted to connect to the next track section. It's just a question of slightly bending down the base on either side so there's a little gap under each of the outer rails. Here I fitted a fish plate to the end of the cut section. Fish plates on the end of 3-rail sections are on the left-hand side looking out from the end. I've found that Atlas Code 100 fish plates that I had on hand work fine with the Dublo 3-rail track. This cut section has a support for the centre rail right at the end. That should make it possible to join it to another section with the connecting tab on the end of the other section pressing up onto the bottom of that centre rail support, and so making contact and providing for centre rail continuity without the need for soldering, although the connection will need to be checked and adjusted if necessary. Next, I started to cut a curved section to provide the half curve required after the point. Again, I started the cut with a razor saw, just next to the centre support for the 3rd rail. I broke quite a number of cutting discs whilst working on this project, 6 I believe, so you want to keep a good stock of discs on hand, and you definitely want to wear safety glasses. Here is the cut half curve connected to the point and with a fish plate fitted to the cut end. Here are the connections underneath the point, which switch the centre rail continuity between the 2 branches. Often that contact coming from the incoming centre rail either won't contact the moving pad contacts for the outgoing rails well, or it will contact both of them at the same time, so there's no isolation. This one actually worked quite well, and all I did was to clean the contacts with electrical contact cleaner. You can see here how the connecting tab on the end of the point is pressing on the folded tabs on the bottom of the support for the centre rail on the end of the cut piece, so providing continuity. This should work okay if both pieces contacting are clean, although it may be necessary to bend the tab upward a bit so that it presses firmly onto the bottom of the support. I put the first 3 pieces into place on the tabletop, the short, cut, straight section connected to the point going to the goods depot, then the right-hand isolating point, and then the cut half-curve section. Next, I completed the revised 3rd track into the shed by adding a half straight and then the remaining part of the full straight that I cut, which was 3/4 of a full straight in length and just what was required to go to the back of the shed. The cut end of that straight section is at the back of the shed, where it won't need to be connected to another track section, but it will just be terminated with a buffer stop. Now I needed to complete the 4th track into the shed, but that clearly couldn't be done just by adding a full straight, since as seen here that would go too far, so I needed to cut again to make a straight section of the required length. I tried the shed over the tracks, which weren't at all fixed down at this point, just to make sure that things seemed to be fitting together properly. It seemed to me that things were coming together okay, other than the need to cut the final straight section. I removed the rolling stock from the shed tracks at this point, as I was going to need to finally adjust them all and then screw them down. I cut the final straight piece, again using a razor saw and cutting discs in the rotary tool. In this case, the centre rail was loose at the end of the section that I wanted to use, with no support at all near the end. So I needed to add an insulated support to keep the centre rail in place at the end of the cut section. I cut a piece of thick card for this purpose. I coloured that card with a gold marker, as this made it blend in a bit better with the colour of the track base, or at least I thought so. Then I stuck the piece of card in place, supergluing it to the track base under the end of the centre rail. Finally, I superglued the centre rail itself to the top of the card piece, keeping it centred between the 2 outer rails. I put fish plates onto the end of the piece with the idea that this would help the buffer stop to hold down the end of the track. This didn't quite work out, as you'll see. I connected that piece up to form the rest of the 4th track into the shed. Next, I put the shed back again and tried to line the tracks up as best as I could, keeping them evenly spaced, as parallel as possible, and clear of the walls and the pillars. As it turned out, it was only possible to work with one fish plate on the ends of the tracks where the buffer stops were fitted. The buffer stops were made with a notch for a fish plate on one side, where the fish plate was expected, but no accommodation to allow for fish plate on the other side, so I had to remove the extra fish plates that I'd put on the ends of the tracks. 003 rail track sections generally all have 2 holes for fixing screws. Of course, when you cut custom sections, you change this. I did drill extra holes for fixing screws in the sections that I cut. You can see the holes that I drilled in the ends of the cut sections on the left here. I screwed down the buffer stops first, with the shed still in place, to fix the end positions of the 4 tracks. Then I lifted the shed again and tested the tracks with a loco to make sure that power connectivity was working as it should. I did in fact find that the straight section of the 4th track wasn't getting any power. The loco would just stop when it got there. This was because the connecting tab on the end of the straight section wasn't pressing firmly enough on the bottom of the centre rail support at the end of the cut curve section. I had to take that straight section up again and bend the connecting tab up a bit to improve the contact, and then things worked. Once I'd determined that power was being passed properly, I screwed down all of the tracks, using the 2mm screws that I bought for this purpose through all of the fixing holes. So now I had all 4 shed tracks in place and screwed down. You can see the set of screws that I bought at bottom right here. Here you can see the fixing screws in place in the holes in the track sections. Finally, I put the shed back over the tracks. Hopefully it should now be possible to park 4 locos in the shed. Of course, the tracks are close together as they go into the shed, but the shed itself is long enough to allow even a Pacific loco with a tender to go fully inside, as seen here with the Duchess of Buccleuch on the left-hand track. Here's the view from the back of the shed. As you can see, the Duchess of Buccleuch at right isn't even right up against the end buffer stop. The screw for the second buffer from the left has come out. That was because it had gone into the gap between 2 of the foam tile sections that form my tabletop. I managed to get the screw to stay in place by taking it out and then driving it in again at an angle so it bit into the foam. So there we are. That's the conclusion of this track laying exercise, and indeed that may well be the last track laying that I do for quite a while, as I don't currently have any more plans for track changes, unless they're required to correct running problems.